Well, we're doing a series through the Psalms. We do 10 Psalms every summer. And this week, we're going to be in Psalm 64. 64. So please open up to Psalm 64. I will read, and we will dive into the text. Psalm 64, hear the word of God. To the choir master, a psalm of David. Hear my voice, O God, in my complaint. Preserve my life from the dread of the enemy. Hide me from the secret plots of the wicked and the throng of the evildoers, who whet their tongues like swords, who aim their bitter words like arrows, shooting them from ambush at the blameless, shooting at him suddenly and without fear. They hold fast to their evil purpose. They talk of laying snares secretly, thinking, who can see them? They search out injustice, saying, we have accomplished a diligent search, for the inward mind and heart of a man are deep. But God shoots his arrow at them. They are wounded suddenly. They are brought to ruin with their word, with their own tongues turned against them. All who see them wag their heads. Then all mankind fears. They will tell. They tell what God has brought about and ponder what he has done. Let the righteous rejoice in the Lord and take refuge in him. Let all the upright in heart exult. It's a beautiful psalm. I wonder if you've ever heard the saying, it's not what you say, but it's how you say it. Have you heard this? Are you familiar with it? Maybe you're a firm believer in it. I think I am. You've probably seen it in action before when a young child comes to his mom and says, give me a drink of milk. And the mom says, why don't we try that again? Why don't we try that one more time? And the child could say, okay, I know what that means. May I have a glass of milk? Or maybe you've seen it in action when one friend says to another friend something a bit harsh or difficult to hear, and the friend says, wow, maybe you could have phrased that a little differently next time. And the friend realizes, okay, I'm sorry. And then they rephrase whatever it is they're trying to communicate to their friend. This saying, it's not what you say, but how you say it, isn't trying to communicate that the content or the what is unimportant. It's not trying to say that. It's trying to say that how you say something, the body language and the demeanor in which you communicate something to someone is important, and perhaps in some cases as important as what you're saying, the content of the message. In Psalm 64, we learn, though, that it's not what you say, nor even how you say it, but who you entrust your words to. That whenever you say something, whether it's a content, the what, or the how, you're entrusting your words to something and to someone. Oftentimes, when we're communicating something to someone, we're entrusting our words to who? The reason for our communication is because we're entrusting the words to ourselves. We have a desired end. We have a desired outcome. We have a goal in mind. We have hopes and aspirations for the communication. And so, we entrust the words to ourselves and we go for it. Psalm 64 begs this question: who do you entrust your words to? Words against you? Words of response against others? Words that you wish you had the courage to say to someone, but could never muster the energy? Who do you entrust your words to? And in Psalm 64, we're going to see 4 pictures that help us to answer that question. Who do I entrust my words to? To myself or to God? So let's dive in here. Here's the 4 in your outline. This is just what we're going to be following here. In the text, there's a clear breakout in the poetic form that there's 4 pictures. The first picture is of David's complaint in verses 1 through 2. The second picture is of the enemy's weapons in verses 3 through 6. The third picture is of God's arrow, and the fourth picture is of the saints' worship in verse 10. Let's look at these pictures one by one and try to answer the question, who do I entrust my words to? Who do you entrust your words to? David's complaint. Let's read verses 1 and 2 together again. David says to God, "Hear my voice, O God, in my complaint. Preserve my life from the dread of the enemy. Hide me from the secret plots of the wicked, from the throng of the evildoers." From the onset, Psalm 64 is a song. It's a psalm. It's intended to be led by the choir master, which is why it says to the choir master, if you see this superscription there. And David has written it for the people of Israel to sing together. It's a song that they're to sing together. So as David is writing this poetic form and waxing eloquently, it's not just for David, it's not just for his journal, but it's for the people of God to sing, led by the choir master. And this psalm in particular is a lament, and it has a certain flavor of complaint against enemies. In the second book of the Psalms, which goes from 43 to 73, or 42 to 72, there's 30 Psalms, and 27 of them have to do with enemies that David is dealing with. 27, there's only 3 in the second book that don't mention or reference enemies. And so this song fits right into book 2. It's a lament and a complaint about enemies. The historical details are unknown. We don't know the historical context. Sometimes the superscription will tell us, but David had many circumstances in his life. Just think about 1 and 2 Samuel. Many circumstances in his life in which he could have written this psalm. God's people have many circumstances in their lives in which they could have sang this psalm. That there are words, there are enemies that are speaking harshly against them. But what came to mind in particular is 1 Samuel 19. And I would encourage you to write it down and go read the story later. But in 1 Samuel chapter 19, what's happening is that Saul has had an immediate turn of affection. And his love for David turns into hatred for David, King Saul. And he gathers all of his companions around him, and he gathers even his son Jonathan, Saul's son Jonathan, around him, and he gathers them in. And he says, "You know what I want you to do? I want you to kill David." Jonathan goes and tells David. David hears about this plot, this secret plot that he's plotting. But Saul tried to do something in secret, tried to deceive David, tried to kill David. And 1 Samuel 19 says, "And Saul spoke to Jonathan and his son and to all his servants, they should kill David." Imagine David's disposition of heart in this moment in time. Some words that come to mind would be despair, hopelessness, utter ruin, anxiety and worry about what will come next. Think about that. You hear that Saul is planning an attack on you. The most powerful man, God's anointed, God's king, God's servant is planning an attack on you. What would you expect would come next? You don't know who's for you. You don't know who's against you. You don't know what kind of schemes or plots they're planning. You don't know what comes around the corner next. And David gets wind that his enemies are against him. There are rumors. There are even words that he's unaware of and perhaps speculating about. He's considering their secret plots and considering just how great their number was. In this moment in time, in this context, Psalm 64 is birthed. And David starts with a word. Hear. Hear. Psalm 64:1, hear. Hear is significant because it's the first word and it's in the imperative, which means that David is expecting a response. Look at it. He says, "Hear. Hear my voice, O God. Hear my voice in my complaint." So David is saying, God, hear me, listen to me, and respond ASAP. Respond to me immediately. This is important. I have a complaint. And just for a clarification on a complaint, when David is talking about a complaint, he's not complaining as if we would be complaining about the Nebraska Huskers or our Nebraska's schedule for this next year, or maybe you would complain about buyer's remorse in buying a certain thing. He's not complaining in that sense. His complaint has more to do with trying to incite change. As if you received bad service at a restaurant and you weren't just going to be complaining about it to your friends later on, but you actually wanted to speak to the manager, you wanted to file a complaint because you wanted things to change in order that you could come back and continue enjoying the restaurant. This is the complaint that David is bringing before God. He's saying, I have a plea. I have something that needs to change. And instead of complaining about it to everyone, what does he do? He brings his complaint to the sovereign manager of the universe. And he says, God, hear my voice, hear my complaint, and I am requesting a response from you. David's enemies are encircling him with their dread, the text says. Dread. Dread is another word for shivering or trembling. And David is saying that these enemies are encircling me, and it's causing me to shiver, that their dread is causing me to quiver. It says that they have secret plots, and that I consider the throng. And throng is another word for mob or a multitude of people. And as we'll see in verse 3, it's their words that David is concerned about in particular. But David knows that the Lord is the sovereign manager of the universe, and so he brings his complaint to God. Verses 1 and 2 alone, just thinking about David's complaint for a minute, doesn't this give us some insight about how we should deal with our complaints? What should we do with our complaints? We should bring them to God. And in so doing, we are entrusting our words, we're entrusting our complaint to God, the sovereign manager of the universe. This is what we ought to do, but also in the opposite, I think David's response and David's complaint actually teaches us perhaps more so what we should not do with our complaints, or at least where our complaints should not find their forever rest. Think about it this way. What do you do with your complaints, brothers and sisters? When someone speaks evil against you, or someone starts a rumor about you, or, just think about it this way, what if someone is saying something untrue about someone you love, like your spouse or your children, or you sense that someone is judging you and spreading just little rumors about that, little mistruths about you here and there, and it spreads like gangrene. You don't know who's heard. You don't know what people believe, and then something comes to you eventually, and you're like, whoa, like I didn't even know that about myself. And then you learn something about yourself that you didn't know because the gossip had spread so far. What do you do in a moment like this? Well, there are three human responses that are very natural in our fallen state. Are you someone who stews, holds it in, and just allows it to stew and mix in this weird amalgam of sinful bitterness and inner rage, inner turmoil and difficulty, frustration, self-pity, thinking, woe is me, feeling so bad for yourself? Or perhaps you're the kind of person that vents, and in your venting and just in your verbal vomiting, it turns into more gossip on top of gossip, or more slander on top of slander, or maybe a verbal attack. How do you respond in a situation like this? Or maybe you're the kind of person that fixes something. If someone aggresses you, you're going to aggress them. And maybe you escalate the situation and say, I'm going to take care of this. I'm going to fix the situation. I'm going to attack it, take the bull by the horns, and I'm going to get this thing done, and we're going to figure this out, and we're going to do it. We're going to take it to the mat. How do you think through your complaint? How do you complain if you actually want to see change? And essentially, you could boil it down this way. Either we can take matters into our own hands with stuffing, internalizing, or venting, or attacking, or we can entrust our complaint to God. Now, the human heart and the human response to difficulty and trial is complex, okay? It's complex and it's difficult, so I don't want to be reductionistic. I don't want to be too simplistic, but I will put it this way. If you have complaints that you have not taken to the Lord, you need to take those to the Lord. if you are a perpetual stuffer or a perpetual venter or a perpetual attacker, and you never at any point in time in pursuing resolve take your complaints to the Lord, then you're not dealing with your complaints in a biblical way. And here's what I would say about this. There's a remedy. There's a remedy for this, that we can help ourselves and we can help others pursue this remedy. So take note here, because we're all a part of this ongoing mishandling of complaints, all of us, whether it's with your best friend or with your spouse or with your children. And as Christians, here's what we should do when this happens. Whenever we see this happening, we should wrap our arm around someone else and say, hey, I love you so much, and I see where you're coming from. But let me ask you a question that's intended to help. Have you taken your complaint to the Lord? And what did God say to you through His Word? Because, brothers and sisters, do you know that God speaks to us about our complaints through His Word? God speaks to us through His Word, and David shows us the pattern that we should bring our complaints to the Lord. So whether it starts with internalizing, whether it starts with venting, or whether it moves to attacking, whatever it is, we should always, always move ourselves and our own hearts and the hearts of others to finally bring the complaint and rest it at the feet of Christ. David entrusts his words and his complaint to the Lord, but there is a stark contrast here and a shift in verse 3. That while David entrusts himself and his words, his complaint to the Lord, what do the enemies do? The enemies entrust their words to their own power, to their own might. Let's look at verse 3 together in 64. Psalm 64. Who whet their tongues like swords, who aim bitter words like arrows, shooting from ambush at the blameless, shooting at him suddenly without fear. They hold fast to their evil purpose. They talk of laying snares secretly, thinking, who can see them? They search out injustice, saying, we have accomplished a diligent search, for the inward mind and heart of a man are deep. On the front end, here's what we see in verses 3 through 6. We see that David talks about his enemies who are attacking him in two ways. So there's two subpoints under this point. David sees in verses 3 and 4 that his enemies are attacking him, so he describes the attack. But secondly, he doesn't only describe the attack, he also describes the motivation in verses 5 and 6. The attack and the motivation, we'll take those in turn. So the first thing that David does is he says, look at this description of them. The attack is great. And what does he say about the enemies? He says that they whet, in the ESV, they whet their swords. They whet their tongues like swords. The literal interpretation or translation here would be of sharpening. They sharpen their sword, and the picture is of a blacksmith who's getting ready a sword for battle. And as he sharpens this sword, stroke after stroke, getting it ready, making sure it's sharp enough, what is he thinking about the entire time? He's thinking about the way in which this sword will be sharp enough to destroy the enemy, to attack the enemy. So he's sharpening his sword. And he says that these enemies are just like that blacksmith who's sharpening his sword, but they're sharpening their tongues in secret, and they're getting ready. They're getting ready for their attack. And they continue to sharpen. The second picture is not only that they're whetting or sharpening their tongues as a sword, but they also aim. They take direct aim at David. And David says, taking aim at the blameless, or in this particular situation, at one who doesn't deserve it. And their aim is really focused in and targeted on David's life and David's reputation. They want to take David down, whatever it takes. The attack is intended to illustrate the sudden, the immediate ambushing of enemies that take a verbal attack upon someone, a verbal attack upon David in this moment in his life when he realizes something. Oh, these enemies are fearless in their striking against me. They're relentless. They will not stop until they see their accomplished end, until they accomplish their purposes. They're sharpening and they're aiming their words, their tongues, right at me. David's enemies continue to seek to destroy. They intend to make their attack as secret as possible. But something that's more troubling than their attack, the sharpening of their tongues, the thing that's more troubling than even their aim of their arrows at David, aiming at his reputation and his life, is secondly their motivation. Look at their motivation in verse 5. They hold fast. They're not going to change. They search out injustice. David says that their motives in verses 5 and 6 are that of those who think that they're doing it in secret. Look at what he says, how he describes them in verse 5. They lay snares secretly, and here's what they think. No one can see them. No one can see them. The enemies are thinking that we have committed our secret plans, that we have planned something which no one can thwart, that no one sees, and it's sitting there like a snare, like an animal is going to be walking into the snare at any moment, and it's going to be stuck in the trap at any moment in time. And they're thinking it's hidden perfectly, it's the perfect plan, now all we have to do is wait for it to be executed. And they think no one sees it. Their thinking is a perversion of a reality as they commend themselves for their continued diligent search to find further ways to perform injustice. The fact that they think that their iniquity and their injustice and their plans are hidden further compound more injustice. Do you see that here in the passage? It says, when they say, in verse 5, who can see them, they continue in verse 6 to search out injustice, saying, we have accomplished a diligent search. They're looking for ways to fulfill their injustice. They have, in fact, searched out many ways to devise injustice for their own selfish gain, destruction, and gratification. Think about Saul for a moment. Why is Saul so upset with David in 1 Samuel 19? What's the issue? Is it because David's offended Saul? Or is it because Saul thinks so highly of himself? And it's the latter. Saul wants to be this great and mighty and majestic warrior, but David is righteous, and God blesses him. And so they come up with a saying, Saul's killed his hundreds, but David's killed his thousands. And when Saul hears that, when he sees David's success, what does he do? He lashes out. And David is teaching us something about the nature of the human heart here. In considering this deep search, David makes a statement. Look at the end of verse 6. For their inward mind and heart of a man, inward heart and mind of a man are deep. Maybe you can relate with David's thinking here. Essentially what David's saying is he's saying, you can't imagine what man is capable of thinking of. You can't imagine. It's so deep, it's so complex, it's so profound, it's so complicated, and it's so wicked and contorted. Who can understand the heart of man? And maybe you can relate with this. Maybe in recent months, recent days, as you watch your favorite social media app on your phone, and you see the utter wickedness that people spew out of their mouths onto their social media page, especially in light of the recent decision of Roe v. Wade. People coming out of the woodwork and talking about children and life as if it were a personal choice or a personal preference, and putting that all over the internet, putting it on blast. When you look at something that it's difficult to imagine, you say, I don't get it. I don't get it. It doesn't make any sense to me. How could someone even imagine something like this, holding a view like this? Or maybe when you see the media and the TV and you see these mass shootings and you hear criminals give their testimony for why they did it, your mind is thinking, what? What kind of world do we live in that someone could think this way, that someone could be that wicked? And this is what David is saying. David says, for the inward mind, the inner thoughts and heart of a man are deep. They're deep waters. When the psalmist cries out, when David cries out, he's essentially looking at the systemic problem of depravity in the world, the systemic problem of injustice, the fact that man continually is searching for ways to be unjust. But here's the thing that we can't forget about. As Christians, as people who submit ourselves to the authority of God's word, brothers and sisters, the corruption is not just out there. The corruption is not just on our social media app. The corruption is not just in the mass shootings. The corruption is here in our own hearts. And we need to come to terms with the fact that the Bible speaks of our own heart as twisted and turned and contorted. Even so that in Jeremiah 17, here's what God's word says. And if you would turn over there with me, I want to read this together. Jeremiah 17. The Bible speaks very clearly and profoundly that corruption is not only far, but corruption is near. That it's not only the heart of those who we think are wicked that is deep and unfathomable, but also our own hearts are deep and complex and filled with depravity. Jeremiah 17, verse 9. The heart is deceitful above all things, desperately sick. Who can understand it? Who gets it? Who understands? And brothers and sisters, if you think you're bad, you only know the half of it. You don't really understand how bad, how wicked, how corrupt your heart is, but God in His kindness, God in His mercy withholds and restrains you from being as bad as you could be. But look at what God continues to say in Jeremiah 17, verse 10. I, the Lord, search the heart, test the mind, the same words used in Psalm 64, the heart and the mind, to give to every man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his deeds. The thing that I want to really press in here is that David is giving us a picture, a small picture of his enemies, but the biblical theme of enemy expands much broader than just David's enemies. And what the Bible would say about enemies on the whole, as we look at the biblical narrative from Genesis to Revelation, is that we, good American citizens or good moral people, we are God's enemies if we're not in Christ. God's enemies. And while David is pleading with God to protect him from the words of his enemies, even in his lifetime, in David's lifetime, he joined the cacophony of voices that were proclaiming, dethrone God. And think about what he did with Bathsheba and taking her unlawfully. Think about what he did in ordering the murder with his words of Uriah and trying to cover it up. David even joins the voices that would seek to dethrone God as an enemy of God. The surprising application of Psalm 64 is that we are the enemies of God who make a verbal attack against God and against God's anointed. How do you use your words? The sharp comment, building yourself up, talking about people behind their back, slander and gossip, speaking in a way to those we love most with such harshness, with such cruelty, that there's murder in our hearts and it comes out of the mouth. Our family, our children's, fellow church members. Words, perhaps they're words you wish you could say, but you don't think that you actually could build up the courage, so you keep it inside your heart. Further, what have you neglected to say that you should have said in order to build up and glorify God? Brothers and sisters, these are just a small example that we have a huge sign on our lips, just like the prophet Isaiah, that says condemned. And how are we condemned? We're condemned by our own words. We condemn ourselves with our own words, with our own actions, with the way that we speak to others. And here's what I would say, that there's hope in this psalm. But before we can get to hope, we need to see the righteousness of God reflected in Psalm 64. First, we need to see the righteousness of God before we can find a resolve for our condemnation that we brought upon ourselves. So we look to the third picture, which is God's arrow. God's arrow. Let's read this together. Starting in verse 7. But God shoots his arrow at them. They are wounded suddenly. They are brought to ruin with their own tongues turned against them. All who see them wag their heads. Then all mankind fears. They tell about what God has brought about and ponder what God has done. Coming into verse 7, I want to note three poetic contrasts here in verse 7. So look at verse 7. It says, but God shoots his arrow. This is in direct contrast to the previous section in verse 3 that says that the enemies, what do the enemies have? The enemies have so many swords that they're sharpening. They have so many arrows. But what does God have? God has his one arrow. And it shows the greatness, and it shows the magnitude, and it shows the power, and it shows that God is not anxious about the enemies, but he has an arrow that will bring a quick and sure justice to the situation compared to the many workings and the many snares and the many weapons and the many swords and the many arrows that the enemy has that human beings try to contrive. And God is not concerned at all. He sits on his throne and he's ready with his arrow of justice to suddenly bring righteousness and justice and equity to the situation. The second contrast that we see is while the enemies are sneaky and they think no one can see our snares, no one can see our traps, who sees it? God. The Lord of the universe sees everything. So first, they're tricked, but secondly, do they see God? No. They can't see God. They don't recognize God. They don't submit themselves to God. So there's a poetic form and contrast here. This is while they think they're being so sneaky, while they think they're getting away with injustice, while they think that they're tiptoeing around anyone so that they can't be seen, God is actually the one who sees and whom they cannot see. They don't see it. They're not ready, which is why his attack is sudden for them. And the third contrast comes with their words. There's a poetic justice that happens here in this psalm. What we see, and this comes in verse 8, they are brought about to ruin with their own tongues turned against them. God brings swift justice in this particular situation by using the words that they've spoken and turning them against them and saying, look, you are self-condemned. By your own words, by your own actions, by your own secret plots, you're self-condemned. And then God does something amazing and he brings it to light. And he brings resolution so that everyone can see, so that every thought and motivation of the heart could be laid bare for everyone to see as if their thoughts were put up on the screen. And everyone can see their motivation and say, whoa, their motivations looked godly, but what were they really? They were for self-gain. They were for selfishness. Do you think Saul could have justified his words against David? Kill David? Absolutely he could have. I could think of 1,000 ways that Saul could justify his words. Oh, David is trying to take over the kingdom. David is trying to exert his will and his authority over me. We need to kill him. Or David is sinning in this particular way. We need to kill David. Saul could have thought of 1,000 reasons for his justification to kill David, and that would have perhaps made sense to us at some point in time, or made sense to the people of Israel. But what God does is he takes the motivations of the heart and he puts it out in the open so that everyone can see it. And David says this brings resolution. It brings it to the light that everyone might see their inner motivations. Yes, God brings resolution to David's enemies. The victory is God's over the wicked man. And the psalmist says that God is the one who brings this swift and mighty justice with one single arrow. Resolution. Completion. Everyone knows now. Everyone knows who God is. Everyone knows who the enemies are. But as we step back, we've been zoomed in on Psalm 64, as we step back and look at how this psalm applies to the larger story and narrative of Scripture, what do we see? Again, we see the fact that David had enemies, but on the whole, we are actually God's enemies. I want you to turn over to Matthew 12. I'll show you a passage of Scripture here. In Matthew 12, Jesus teaches us about our words. Matthew 12:33. Jesus says, either make the tree good and its fruit good, or make the tree bad and its fruit bad. For the tree is known by its fruit. You brood of vipers, he says, how can you speak good when you are evil? For out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. The good person out of the good treasure brings forth good, and the evil person out of his evil treasure brings forth evil. I tell you, on the day of judgment, people will give an account for every careless word that they speak. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. What Jesus is doing here is he's saying, look, similar concept that David was talking about with bringing justice upon his enemies by making known, bringing to light all of the wicked deeds of his enemies. God does the exact same thing with every human being. Imagine the motivations of your heart and all the words you've spoken that you thought were in secret, that you would have never said if anyone else was around. Imagine those being put on display for all to see, and then God saying in a poetic justice fashion, now, are you condemned? Answer the question. Are you condemned? Would you be condemned? Or would you be justified by your words? I confess before all that I would stand condemned. From the time I was a child, even one of my earliest memories of cutting someone else down, I remember the distinct feeling of anger overflowing out of my heart through my mouth as I cursed at my brother. Time and time again, even as God has brought me along and grown me in sanctification and brought me into his marvelous light, still, brothers and sisters, don't we often find that this is the case, that our hearts still have a bent toward evil and wickedness and self-gain? And even as believers, Jesus says, look, everything you say, everything you do, all the motivations in your heart are going to be put on display for everyone to see, and in a poetic justice type of form, you will have to give an account for every word, and your words will justify or condemn you. And brothers and sisters, we stand condemned. We stand condemned. But there's one who speaks a better word than the words that we have spoken. It comes from Romans chapter 3. I want to show you Romans 3. It's a beautiful reminder of the truth that we have righteousness not based on our own words, our own merit, but based on Christ. Romans 3, starting in verse 10. The Apostle Paul, in bringing together some Old Testament passages, teaches us about the corruption of the human heart and really what we should do with our mouths before God. Paul says in Romans 3, starting in verse 10, no one is righteous. No, not one. He's anticipating the question. No one understands. No one seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Their throat is an open grave. Their tongues are meant for deceiving. Their venom and asps is under their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood, and their path are their ruin and misery. And the way of peace they do not know. There is no fear of God in their eyes. And now listen to the way he says what we should do with our mouths. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped, so that every mouth may be shut, and the whole world may be held accountable to God. Same theme as Matthew 12. For by your works, by works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. The picture is that all of our actions, all of our words are on display before God. And what are we to do? We can't defend ourselves. You can't. So our mouths are shut. Condemned. Self-condemned. But verse 21 brings hope and clarification for why we're all here this morning. But now, the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. And what is it, brothers and sisters, other than the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe? Our justification, our righteousness, does not come from defending ourselves, does not come from the words that we speak in order to justify ourselves, but it comes from shutting our mouths and saying it's by faith and faith alone in a beautiful and wonderful Savior, Jesus Christ, who gave himself for me. And brothers and sisters, while God had his bow of justice aimed accurately and rightly at us, as he was lining up his bow of justice that was meant for you when you were about ready to give an account or justify yourself, somehow at that last moment, Christ Jesus, in his benevolence and in his divine forbearance and in his plan from eternity past, stepped in and he took the arrow of God's justice. Why? So that you might be considered his righteousness. So that you might have a relationship with God. And that's why it's purely by faith in Jesus Christ. And that's why in Romans 5:10 it says, while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, Jesus Christ. Brothers and sisters, this moves us to worship. The worship of the saints. Let's move to the fourth picture of the saints' worship. Let the righteous one rejoice in the Lord and take refuge in him. Let all the upright in heart exult. The righteous rejoice because of what Christ has done in the big plan, in the narrative of the biblical storyline. Because of what Christ has done in taking the wrath of God on our behalf, we rejoice. We're righteous not based on our own merit or our own goodness, but because of the merit of Christ, by faith in Christ. So we take refuge in him, we exult, and we find resolution that leads to worship. But here's a question. Did David wait until the conflict was resolved in verse 10 to rejoice? Did David have to wait until his conflict was resolved? Well, brothers and sisters, let me tell you a secret that Scripture talks about all the time that will lead to your joy and contentment. Let me tell you a truth that will lead to much satisfaction in this life. Throughout the past ages, not every saint who entrusted every word to Christ in this life had a favorable outcome in this present life. Read Scripture. Read how Christ's life ended. Read how Paul's life ended. Consider the fact that throughout the ages, Christians have been persecuted for thousands of years, being hung on stakes and burned and tarred. The saints of old did not find their solace or their rest in their present circumstances, but rather they found their rest in the present promises of God, which will fulfill their outcome, which will bring us to completion. Therefore, your resolve starts today. Your resolve in verse 10 can happen right now in this congregation. You don't have to wait until every stone is unturned. You don't have to wait until every problem is resolved. You don't have to wait until every conflict is undone. You can find your rest and your solace in Christ now. David looks to the sovereign, eternal God in order to find rest in his promise. I will never leave you or forsake you, the Lord promises. Think about the way that David responded to Saul when Saul was persecuting him. Saul entrusted himself in the situation to God. He did not retaliate. He did not rebuke Saul. He submitted himself in his life to Saul, and in so doing, he entrusted himself to the sovereign, caring, providential care of God. David finds sweet rest and joy in the unchanging character of God in the midst of hardship. Brothers and sisters, do not entrust your words to anger. The anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Do not entrust your heart and your words to intuition or to your bitterness or to your own power or to your own stewing or to worldly thinking and retaliation, but entrust every word to Christ. And let me help you by giving you 5 practical measures that we can take, and then we will close. In order to entrust every word to Christ, first, don't be surprised. Simply don't be surprised. That's half the battle. Don't be surprised. The Apostle Peter says this very thing when he's talking to Christians in the first century who are facing hardship and persecution. He says, "Beloved, those who I love dearly, who Christ loves dearly, don't be surprised when fiery trials come upon you, as if something strange were happening to you. Don't be surprised." And I would encourage you with the same message. Don't be surprised when difficulty and hardship and someone speaks against you. Don't be surprised. Why? Because this is the path that Christ has set before us. Think about Christ's own incarnation. Think about his humiliation on the cross. Think about his exaltation and resurrection and ascension to the right hand of the throne of God. This is the path that God has charted for us to walk. Don't be surprised when others speak against you harshly, when you face difficulty and the fiery arrows of the enemy. Don't be surprised as if something strange were happening to you. This is God's will for your life. Number 2 is don't trust your instincts. When the fiery trial comes upon you, when someone speaks evilly against you, don't trust your instincts. Do not do it. Even if you give into it for a moment, don't continue in that thinking. Find someone who's going to help point you to Christ. Point your heart to Christ, and in so doing, you'll remember Jeremiah 17 that tells you what your heart is and what your intuition will really lead you into. Number 3, bring your concern, bring your complaint to God in prayer. God wants to hear from you. God can handle your complaint. Think about 1 Peter 5:7. It says, cast all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. Because he cares for you. Number 4, scour God's word in order to identify what God requires of you. What does God require of you? What is God speaking to you through his word? Bring your concern to God and then ask God from his word, what would you have me do? How would you have me respond? How would you shape my disposition? How would you have me repent if I've been in sin? How would you have me address this brother or this sister or this situation? Scour God's word. Go to other brothers and sisters for advice. And really try to see what God requires of your heart and of your hand. Because all Scripture is breathed out by God and useful for correction and reproof and rebuke and admonishment and teaching and for training in righteousness. And brothers and sisters, this is the way in which God works all things together for your good. Which brings us to number 5, trust God for the outcome. Trust God for the outcome. It's not in your hands. It's not in your power. It's not in your control. He has your good in mind, and he will bring a swift and righteous judgment to the situation. Brothers and sisters, when we can come to the point that we can trust God with the outcomes, we can find rest and joy in our present situation. If we trust God with the outcome, we can find present rest and joy in every situation, and every word becomes an opportunity to glorify God, whether it's your spouse and the way they speak to you. It's an opportunity to entrust your complaint to the Lord and say, Lord Jesus, I know you hold me in your hands, and I know you have my good in mind in this situation. Help me for how I can respond with my head and my heart in this situation and be faithful and trust God with the outcome. If you're in a fight with someone, what do? You entrust the situation to the Lord, and you trust that he is going to use that for your good and for his glory. If you're facing the most difficult and complex situation you've ever been in with words being spewed at you, what do? You entrust yourself and the words and your complaint to the Lord because he holds the outcomes. And when you trust God for the outcome, you can find rest and joy in the present. So, brothers and sisters, I hope that I've convinced you that the most important thing about our words is who we entrust them to. Not about what or about how, as much as it is about who we're entrusting our words to. So let's pray, and we will close together. Lord Jesus, we thank you again for this time, for your kindness, and for your mercy. And Lord, we ask that you would help us to entrust our words to you. It's in your holy and good name we pray. Amen. Now, if you